Hello, I am Giles Hinchcliff. I am a principal SRE. I am a co-founder of Rebel Astronaut, as you already know. And for the last few years of my career, I've been kind of focused on transformation. And that often means that I'm the guy kind of firing people up within organizations and saying, maybe this could be different, right? And in another way that, I transform things is I say, oh, you guys have a problem over here. Well, these guys have the same problem over there. Maybe you guys can talk to each other. That kind of makes me, and so I tend to have a career connecting silos. And occasionally I code, right? But it wasn't always this way. I used to be an artist. And so this image is from 2007 in the Deviant Art Festival in Sweden, where I was performing a piece of art called The Story of Art Told Through the Medium of Mexican Wrestling, right? And we had choreographed an entire Mexican wrestling match. And what we would do is we would pause at different points, the lights would go down, and someone would read out, the birth of Venus, or the birth of Adam, or whatever. And that was great until I needed to pay my rent. And so I got into technology, and thus began probably about 5 years of me being kind of doing tech support, right? And basically kind of trying to figure out how do I get into this industry. I had no education in it. No one had taught me what to do. And I was making it up as I went along. And when I was kind of thinking back about how I kind of got from that point to where I am today, I realized something really quite scary, right? And there was a conversation. So I was bored in my job. So I went for an interview in about 2014. So this was about 5 years after I kind of gave up being an artist. And I was in this interview. It was like kind of the very beginning of a DevOps role. And the guy into the interview turned around to me and said, do you know what Docker is? Are you using Docker? Of course you're using Docker, right? Really confident guy. And I turned around and said, what's Docker? Like, what the hell is this thing? Right. And, I kind of felt stupid. I didn't get the job. Right. But the way this guy was talking to me about Docker made me go, something kind of sparked on me. And I was like, this is really interesting, right? Like maybe I can look into what this thing called Docker is, right? And from that chance conversation, I didn't get the job, but I hated how stupid I felt in that moment. And I researched Docker and I realized no one knew what Docker was, right? It was just this guy had kind of like decided really confidently, I know what Docker is, therefore I expect everyone to know what Docker is. But actually, there was probably only about 40 people in the country at that point in time who knew what Docker was, right? And so I researched. I was like, this seems kind of cool. This guy seems kind of cool. And from that point, I kind of, because I could put Docker on my CV, I then became in demand, right? And because a lot of the people, the companies that were using Docker, and then further from then on Kubernetes, were big kind of transformation projects, and they tended to be actually in a lot of enterprises. I know I was talking to Ben about when I was working in the Home Office, and that was one of the biggest Kubernetes clusters in the country at the time, right? So I got into transformation, right? And I accidentally found myself on the bleeding edge of technology, right? And we were doing stuff that other people weren't doing, right? And I kind of had this moment where I had to sit down and go, if something else had happened, right, if they had decided they didn't like my CV, or they hadn't, the guy had decided he wasn't going to ask that question about Docker, or I missed the bus or something, and they hadn't asked that question at that point in time, then that's terrifying, right? Then my entire career wouldn't have happened as it has happened, and that really scared me, right? But it kind of gave me fuel as well. I needed to find a way that I could predict that thing occurring again, right? So I started researching, and I looked at lots of things, and actually kind of quite a few things that Grant shared as well. I started kind of looking at different ways that we've kind of predicted technological change in the past, right? And the first way that we did is the Kondratiev wave, right? And this is where kind of macroeconomics come in, right? So we've got the Kondratiev wave has been going. We've kind of nailed it down since 1780-ish, right? And all of these dates here are really, really vague. So do not take them. It's not the 1st of January 2000, right? It's somewhere around 2000 to 2005, right? We don't know. But we've been through 5 waves in totality right now. We're halfway through the 6th wave at the moment. The first wave was around steam engines. So there was this big kind of societal shift where textiles and clothing began to boom, right? And what that was the beginning of factories. So we had the textile factories, which drew people out from the villages into towns that were kind of built around these factories, right? And because we needed to then move kind of the textiles from the factories to the places they were going to be sold, you also have the steam engines occurring at the same time, yeah? Then the wave 2, we're talking about kind of railways. We suddenly have public transport. So before that, someone would have maybe lived in the same village or not kind of gone within 10 miles of where they were born in their lifetime. And that was quite common, right? The minute we start to have public transport, like mass migration begins to happen, right? And that's another massive technological shift. Then we kind of building on the factories. So we kind of got electrical engineering, we've got chemistry, we've got mass consumption. So people are able to buy stuff, right, that they potentially weren't able to buy. And then wave 4, we're talking about automobiles. So whereas before you'd have to get a train, now you'd have your own car. And then the most recent one that is kind of complete is information technology. Right, so we're talking, and when we talk about information technology, we're talking about it from a perspective of communication. Yeah, so we're saying, so between kind of 1980 and 2000, there was a massive boom in the speed in which we could communicate with each other. Right. Now, wave 6 started around about 2005. And we're at some point in that process, so it hasn't ended yet. Although there's some information later on that will kind of indicate where we think we are. So I've got this. I've kind of looked it up. The Kondratiev wave, great, but if I want to kind of predict that again, this is useless to me. Right, I can say, well, at some point within the next 30 years, right, something's going to change, and so that's not that. When I want to say I want to be able to see the new thing that's coming, and I want to be able to hit on that when it happens. The Kondratiev wave is not that, right. The problem with it is it's retrospective, right? Like, so we don't know what wave 6 is because the value of hindsight. So we can say probably in about 30 years, well, wave 6 was definitely software, or kind green technology or whatever it ends up being, right? But right now we can't say that. And because we can't say that, we can't really act on it. But it's a start, right? And it's something that we can kind of start to dig into from there. So I continued researching, and I found Carlota Perez, right? Carlota Perez is a professor specializing in techno-economic paradigm shifts, and all those things that we've just discussed are paradigm shifts, right? So she won the Silver Kondratiev Medal for her work, and she developed the Perez technological surge cycle. She also once lost me a job. Not personally, I haven't met her, but I was going for a director of DevOps role with a very big technology company, and I'd gone through maybe 8 waves of interviews with different directors in the organization, and I got to the CEO, right? And this CEO is kind of a bit of a celebrity CEO, multi-millionaire, and he asked me, who do you think the most important person in technology is, right? And I said, well, actually, I think Carlota Perez is the most important person in technology because she predicts it, right? And he said, all right, thank you very much. I think that's the end of the interview. And I think I kind of feel like maybe I didn't say him, and maybe there's something else going on. But yeah, she did lose me a job once. But moving on, let's talk about her surge cycle, because I think that's actually the interesting bit, right? So this is the Perez surge cycle. And so if we go back to the Kondratiev waves, what she did is she took that wave and she broke it up into different sections. Yeah. And so we start off with the eruption, right? There's this new thing on the block, right? And there's, you know, a bunch of cool, hip, trendy guys in flip-flops, kind of, you know, probably with big beards, kind of figuring out what's going on with this new hip, trendy technology. And that's like the big bang. And then suddenly someone else, you know, probably slightly better shaven, notices what these guys are looking at, right? And they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, and then suddenly that eruption turns into a frenzy, right? And everyone, and you've got everybody is looking at this new hot thing. Now, I'm sure all of you can recognize this kind of series of events in the current technological culture, right? And then we hit a turning point. Now, the turning point's really important because it specifically is triggered by an external macroeconomic event, right? So when I say an external macroeconomic event, what I'm talking about is, say, a pandemic or a recession or a war, right? Something that kind of shakes the economy in such a way that kind of makes everyone kind of come out, wake them up from their frenzy, kind of grow them up and go, right, we should probably behave like adults now. So after that turning point, everyone's kind of woken up, we go into synergy. Right. And what happens in the synergy? Say you've got 100 different startups that have been created, that'll whittle down to like 2, 3, or 4 who will be the kind of examples of that period of technology. Now, almost all enterprises today have gone through this cycle and have come out the other end, right? So there was a point where they were a startup and they rode this wave, and they were the ones that won in that kind of cycle. Right. And then they become, and then you go into maturity, and then you're the one that all the other new startups are kind of going to go after and try and disrupt. Right. Now, looking back, I was really lucky because what do you know about Docker happened right at the beginning of that. So at the time, I was kind of in data centers working with like Windows servers. And someone said, what do you know about Docker? It was right on the cusp of that eruption. So when I kind of was looking at some, code in Python or whatever the hell Docker was at that point in time, I was, right at the beginning. And so this is kind of cool because we can kind of go, okay, we can see where everything is. We can actually map things out on this graph and see and kind of see, okay, what can we do? Just to double down, like, the wave split in 5 parts, the eruption, the frenzy, the turning point, the synergy, and then the maturity. All right. So if we look at that, what's really awesome about this is this represents the macroeconomy. So we go back to the Kondratiev wave, we can use this model to say where we are within a Kondratiev wave. And actually where we think we are is we think we've just come out of that turning point. So there is things like the pandemic, things like the war in Ukraine, things like, and if there's, they are big enough macroeconomic events that can cause that shift. So there is effectively what people are calling like 20 years, 20-year kind of golden age of technology is what people think are going to happen. But the beauty of this is it doesn't just work on the macro, right? You can follow a much smaller interview. So when Grant was saying, he was saying, technology shifts into every 10 years, that's probably true too, right? There's probably much smaller kind of technological shifts that don't have the same societal impact. And so if we say Docker, if someone says to you, if I was to turn to someone and say, someone was going to say, I'm going to start a Docker startup, I would say, yeah, probably not. Now's not the right time, right? I think it's happened. It's gone. Similarly with cloud, right? There is kind of 3 or 4 strong kind of incumbents in cloud. If you wanted to go and disrupt that market, you'd need millions and millions of pounds to kind of do that, to start that. And so if you're looking for an easy way to make a buck, that's probably not it. Similarly with DevOps, right? Like we've had kind of some really good times with DevOps in the last kind of 10, 15 years, or 10 years, I guess. Now I think it's, again, if you're going to start a company with DevOps, probably not. Crypto feels like it's hit a turning point for me. And let me be honest, I'm making, I'm making judgment calls. You guys make your own judgment calls on all of these. Now, crypto feels like it's being shaken up. There's a lot of crypto companies that have kind of disbanded and disappeared in the last few years, and so maybe that's because that's hit the turning point. And then AI is almost certainly going through a frenzy at the moment. Now, yeah, you can absolutely get on that, and remember, when we hit the turning point in the synergy, not all companies just kind of go bankrupt, they get bought as well. And that is another way to be assimilated within an organization. So, you might be all right if you kind of want to jump on AI at this point. But then what we're looking at is things like developer experience. That seems like something that is in kind of research at the moment and is looking really, really interesting, quite compelling. And then there's going to be a ton of other things, right? This is a constant, and we have to kind of keep navigating this wave as we go. As a final piece, navigating the future like a pro. Don't buy into the frenzy. Right, there's numerous kind of cartoons of like, people going, oh, I was a crypto guy and now I'm an AI guy, and before that I was a DevOps guy. Right, find something at the right time and stick to your guns. It's never going to be, finding something that excites you is going to be is going to get more and more and more important, I think, especially as kind of AI kind of reduces or removes the kind of technical skill level, or reduces the technical skill level that's required. I think what's going to be replaced is like a much higher level skill, so like almost an architectural skill. So you can maybe ask something like an LLM what to write, but you need to know, you have a vision of what you want to get, and I think that's going to become more and more important. Also, I think what's really important is figuring out what's exciting everyone else, but also find out what pains are we trying to solve. And I think that's a big question around AI at the moment, is actually what are we solving with that? Like, and it's even an even better question with crypto, right? What are we actually doing? Like, what is it actually done to make things better? I know there's a lot of kind of vision statements around what it could do, but has anyone got any examples of it doing those things? And, you know, for example, for us, I think we think DevX solves a ton of problems that weren't solved with DevOps, right? So DevOps had an opportunity to be all about developers and operations and talking to each other. That didn't happen, right? They didn't happen because it was too hard. You know, and so I think developer experience and communities and things like that is actually something that is an opportunity for DevX. And that is me. We have some AI generated memes that we've been playing with using AI. And does anyone have any questions?